The thing about being a father is that you never expect to become a burden to your own child. But one Tuesday evening, I was heading down the hall when I heard my daughter Lydia on the phone with her husband. "A cheap home," she said, "somewhere that stops the money drain." She didn't know I was listening. She also didn't know that for over a decade, I've been the anonymous donor covering her mortgage and her kids' college funds. The man she wanted to put away was the very one keeping her world from falling apart. And I had no intention of going quietly. My name is Arthur. I'm 72, a retired civil engineer. After my wife passed, I moved in with my daughter Lydia and her family in the house I bought 40 years ago. It was supposed to be temporary, but 6 years passed, and recently Lydia stopped seeing me as her father. She started seeing me as a line item she couldn't balance. I heard her that Tuesday, talking to her husband about a facility, something affordable to stop the drain. She didn't know I was listening. And she certainly didn't know that for over a decade. I had been the anonymous donor covering her mortgage and her children's college tuition. The man she was ready to discard was the very one keeping her world from collapsing. So I made a decision. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply began to pack. I had lived in that house for 40 years. It was a modest 4-bedroom colonial in a neighborhood that hadn't yet been discovered by flippers or developers. My wife Ellen and I bought it in 1983 for $63,000, which at the time felt like an impossible sum. We raised our daughter Lydia there. We painted the kitchen yellow the summer she turned 7, because she insisted yellow was the color of happiness. Ellen passed in 2011 on a Thursday morning in that kitchen, coffee cup still warm, the crossword half finished. After the funeral, Lydia suggested I move in with her family. "Just for a while," she said, "until you find your footing." That while became 6 years. And somewhere in those 6 years, I stopped being dad and started being a problem that needed solving. The shift didn't happen all at once. It happened in small, almost invisible increments. The way Lydia stopped asking my opinion on things and started giving me updates instead. The way her husband Randall stopped looking me in the eye when we discussed household expenses. The way conversations about the future became clipped, uncomfortable, redirected whenever I entered the room. Randall worked in commercial real estate and, from what I could piece together, the past 3 years had been lean. Lydia was teaching fewer piano lessons. Their 2 daughters, my granddaughters, were both in college now, and the tuition wasn't getting cheaper. I understood money trouble. I'd lived through it. What I didn't understand was that in their accounting, I had become a line item. On a Tuesday evening in early March, I had gone to bed around 9:30, which is my habit. Ellen used to tease me that I turned into a pumpkin if I stayed up past 10. But I forgot my reading glasses downstairs, so I padded back toward the kitchen. Footsteps quiet on the carpet runner, and that's when I heard Lydia's voice. She was in the living room on her cell phone, speaking in the low, compressed tone people use when they're discussing something they don't want overheard. I stopped. "I know." I heard her say, "But we've run the numbers, and at this rate, we're going to lose the house. There's a facility up near Clarksville, nothing fancy obviously, but it's what we can afford." The pause. Then, "I know it sounds harsh, Mom, but we can't keep bleeding money like this. And honestly, Dad is the biggest drain." The biggest drain. That's the phrase she used. I stood in the hallway in my slippers and felt something cold settle into my chest. Not anger exactly. Something quieter than anger. My daughter, my only child, was on the phone with her grandmother, discussing me the way you'd discuss a leak in the roof or a transmission failure on an aging car. I didn't confront her. I didn't let the floorboard creak. I went back upstairs, lay down in the dark, and stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep. But the next morning, I began making phone calls. You see, there's something about me that Lydia never bothered to learn. For the past 12 years, I have been the sole benefactor of the Margaret Hawthorne Family Foundation. It's a small charitable trust that I created in my wife's mother's name, using the money I'd saved and invested over a 35-year career in civil engineering. The foundation's purpose was always simple: to support the education and housing needs of family members who fell on hard times. Anonymously, I'd structured it that way deliberately because I believed that help given quietly preserves dignity. What I never anticipated was that the biggest recipients of that help would be my own daughter and granddaughters, who had no idea the money was coming from me. For over a decade, the foundation had been covering Lydia's mortgage shortfalls. It had paid for both girls' college tuition, the books, the dorm fees. Every time they were close to the edge, a check would arrive from a lawyer who told them it was a grant from a generous anonymous donor. They never questioned it. They just accepted the relief and moved on. And now that same daughter was planning to put me in a cheap facility to save a house that I had already paid for 3 times over. I didn't call the lawyer immediately. First, I called a residential community called Willowbrook up in Wilmington. It's the kind of place that has a waiting list and a brochure with photos of people laughing on a veranda. I'd looked into it once out of curiosity, filed the information away like I file everything. When the admissions director answered, I gave her my name and asked if they had any availability. She told me the wait would be at least 8 months. I told her I could pay the entire first year in advance, and I'd like to tour that afternoon. There was a short, respectful pause. She said she'd clear her calendar. And here's the thing I want you to understand. I wasn't angry. Anger is a fire that burns itself out quickly. What I felt was something more precise. I felt that a contract had been broken. The implicit contract between a father and a daughter that says we take care of each other, not because the law requires it, but because we are bound by something deeper. Lydia had forgotten that contract. My job was to remind her. Not with shouting. Not with threats. With the quiet, patient, unshakable truth of who I actually am. I toured Willowbrook that same afternoon. The place was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that doesn't apologize for itself. I counted a library, a heated pool, a chef who came out and shook my hand and talked about his seasonal menu like he was describing a work of art. The admissions director, a woman named Harriet, tried very hard to remain professional, but I saw her glance at my casual sweater and worn leather shoes, and I saw the little furrow of doubt between her eyebrows. When I wrote the check for the full year, including the deposit, her doubt vanished. I moved in 6 days later, and I told no one in my family. I packed while Lydia was at her piano student's recital and Randall was at work. It didn't take long. A lifetime reduces to surprisingly little when you're deliberate about what you keep. I took my clothes, my books, a photograph of Ellen, my reading glasses, and a small wooden box I'd never shown anyone. I left the furniture. I left a note on the kitchen table with my new address and 3 words: "Come see me." The first 48 hours at Willowbrook were peaceful. I ate grilled salmon. I started a mystery novel. I met a retired history professor named Gerald who could recite entire speeches from Churchill. And then, on the 3rd morning, my phone rang. It was Lydia. Her voice was tight, the way it gets when she's trying to control herself. "Dad, what did you do?" I set down my coffee and looked out the window at the garden. "I moved," I said. "You were planning to move me anyway. I just saved you the paperwork." There was a long silence, the kind that travels through a phone line like a held breath. And then she said, "Where are you exactly?" I gave her the address. She whispered something I didn't catch, but I heard the click of her hanging up. She was on her way. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the conversation we were about to have would either rebuild our family or shatter it forever. Lydia arrived alone. I had expected Randall to be with her, hovering in the doorway the way he does when he's trying to manage a situation, but she came by herself. That told me something. She wanted to face me without an audience. She wore the same coat she'd had for 3 winters, the gray wool with the button missing on the left cuff. I noticed it because I'd offered to sew it back on once, and she'd said she didn't have time for that. She walked into the lobby of Willowbrook like she was searching for a mistake. The polished floors, the fresh flowers on the reception desk, the piano softly playing somewhere down the hall, none of it matched the picture she had in her head of where I was supposed to be. Harriet, the admissions director, greeted her with perfect professional warmth and offered her a tour. Lydia ignored her and walked straight toward me. I was sitting in the library with Gerald, who was mid-sentence on the Suez Crisis. He looked at Lydia, looked at me, and said, "I suspect you're needed elsewhere." I stood up slowly. My back had been stiff that morning. I was 72, and I felt it more honestly now than I ever had before. Lydia's eyes swept the room, the leather chairs, the walnut shelves, the window overlooking a courtyard where someone had planted roses in a pattern that spelled out welcome. She turned to me, and the first thing she said was, "How are you paying for this?" Not hello. Not Dad. Are you okay? How are you paying for this? The question was a weapon, and she wielded it the way someone does when they believe they already know the answer. I folded my hands on the back of the chair in front of me and looked at her the way I used to look at her when she was 10 and trying to hide a broken vase. "Let's take a walk," I said. Willowbrook has a garden path that loops around a small pond. I had walked it every morning since I moved in. I led her outside, and she followed, arms crossed tight across her chest. For the first 5 minutes, neither of us spoke. The fountain gurgled. The gravel crunched under our shoes. Finally, she stopped near a bench and turned to face me. "Dad," she said, "I'm not here to play games. You walked out of the house in the middle of the day like you were sneaking out, and you left a note that said, 'Come see me.' You moved into a place I know for a fact costs more than you have. So please, for once, just tell me the truth. For once." That phrase sat between us like a stone. I took my time answering. "Lydia," I said, "when your mother was still alive, we used to sit on a bench very much like this one and talk about what would happen to each of us when the other was gone. And I told her that if I was ever in a position where I depended on our daughter, I would make sure I was never a weight she had to carry." She looked away when I said that. Just for a split second, but I saw it. I knew I had found the nerve I needed to touch. I opened my coat, and from the breast pocket I pulled out a folded document. It was the first page of the Margaret Hawthorne Family Foundation's annual distribution summary. I didn't hand it to her yet. I just held it. 14 years ago, I said, I took every dollar I had saved during my career, every bonus, every dollar Ellen and I had put aside for a retirement we never got to take together, and I placed it into a charitable foundation. I named it after your grandmother. The foundation's purpose was to support the housing and education of family members in need. Anonymously, she blinked. "I don't understand what that has to do with you being here." I handed her the paper. The top line showed the foundation's total assets. The bottom line showed the previous year's distributions. One of those distributions, a substantial one, was labeled Mortgage Assistance, Lydia H. and Randall H. The date on it was September 22nd of the year before, which she would remember as the month they almost lost the house. She stared at the page. Her lips moved as if she was reading it twice just to be sure. "What is this?" she whispered. I sat down on the bench. I let her stand. "For the last 10 years," I said, "every time you and Randall fell behind on the mortgage, the foundation made up the difference. Every time the girls needed tuition money, books, dorm fees, the foundation covered it. You never knew, because I structured the payments through a lawyer who called them anonymous grants. I didn't want gratitude. I didn't want control. I wanted to help you the way your mother would have helped you, quietly, without strings." Lydia's face went through a series of changes I cannot fully describe. It was like watching a tower of cards collapse floor by floor. She looked at the paper again, then at me, then back at the paper. "You?" she said, and the word was raw and small. "You're the anonymous donor." I nodded. She sat down hard on the other end of the bench. 10 years. All that money, the college funds, the house. That was you. For just a moment I thought I saw relief trying to form. But then it died. A darker expression replaced it, a slow, cold understanding that pulled her spine straight and tightened her jaw. "So all this time," she said, "you watched us struggle. You watched me worry myself sick about losing the house. You watched me cry over those tuition bills, and you sat in my living room and said nothing. You let me think I was failing. I had expected this. I had expected her to pivot from shock to anger. Because anger is easier. If she could make me the villain, she could salvage some of her own self-image. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand why you're angry," I said. "But I want you to ask yourself something. If I had told you 10 years ago that I was the one sending those checks, what would you have done?" She opened her mouth, closed it. I continued. "You would have refused the money. I know you. You would have said you couldn't take my retirement savings, and you would have worked yourself into a grave trying to pay for everything alone. Or Randall would have convinced you that taking money from me meant I would interfere in your lives, and you would have pulled away. I chose secrecy because I didn't want to lose you. I wanted you to have the life you deserved without the weight of obligation." She shook her head slowly, and the conversation I overheard on the phone the night before I left. "Tell me what you heard," she said, but her voice was not level. "I heard you tell your mother that I was the biggest drain on your household. I heard you say you had found a facility up near Clarksville, nothing fancy, but what you could afford. You said we can't keep bleeding money like this, and you said Dad is the biggest drain." Her face lost every defense. She looked at me with eyes that were suddenly rimmed with red. "I didn't come here to humiliate you," I said. "I came here because when I heard those words, I realized that the woman I raised had forgotten who I was. And I could either rage against that, or I could show you. So I moved into the best retirement community I could afford. I put the first year on a check the size of which I have never written before. And I waited for you to come see me." A long silence. A bird landed on the fountain, splashed, flew off. Then Lydia spoke, and her voice had cracked like ice beginning to melt. "Dad, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I was scared. The house, the girls' tuition, Randall's work drying up, I couldn't see a way out. And you were just there, in the house, and it felt like one more thing I couldn't fix. That doesn't make it right, but I need you to know it wasn't about you. It was about my own failure." I believed her. That was the hardest part. I could hear the truth in what she was saying. But there was another layer to this that I had not yet revealed, and I knew it would change the shape of this conversation before it was done. I reached into my interior pocket again and pulled out a second document. This one was older, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. I opened it carefully. When I set up the foundation, I said, I did something else. I created a provision that triggers if certain conditions are met. One of those conditions is if a beneficiary attempts to remove me from my home without my consent. Legally, that provision activates a review of all historical distributions, including the ones that went to you. She stared at the paper. What does that mean? It means, I said, that the Foundation's board, which consists of myself and 2 independent trustees, is now required to examine whether the funds I disbursed to you were fully above board, given that the primary benefactor was about to be institutionalized against his will. It means the tax-exempt status of those distributions could be called into question. This is not a threat, Lydia. I am telling you this because you need to understand that the secret I kept was not just about money. It was a legal architecture, and you almost crashed into it. She put her head in her hands. I sat beside her and waited. I didn't touch her. I didn't offer comfort. I let her sit with the full weight of what she had nearly done and what I had quietly been doing for her entire adult life. After a long while, she dropped her hands and looked at me with something that resembled a question I had not heard since she was a little girl asking me to explain the stars. What do we do now? I was about to answer when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind us. It was Randall. He had driven up separately, and he was walking toward us with the expression of a man who had already decided this was someone else's fault. I recognized the look. I had seen it on Stuart Hale's face in a different story. He said, "Lydia, what's going on?" And the way he said it told me he had no idea what I was about to say next. But I will never forget the way his face shifted when I stood up and told him that the man he thought was a drain on his household had been funding his entire life for a decade. And that I had the receipts. Randall stopped about 10 feet from the bench, his eyes moving from Lydia to me and back again. And I could see him processing the scene the way a real estate agent processes a property he's about to lose. He didn't know what had been said, but he knew the shape of it. He'd spent 6 years treating me like a piece of furniture that had been moved into his house without his permission, and the furniture was now sitting in a garden he couldn't afford to walk through. "What's going on?" he said again, and this time his voice had an edge, the kind a man uses when he feels control slipping. Lydia looked up at him and said, "Dad is the anonymous donor. The foundation, the mortgage, all of it. For 10 years. The words landed on Randall like a bucket of cold water. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. He looked at me, and I saw the calculation flickering behind his eyes. The same calculation I'd seen in every contractor who ever tried to overbill me on a bridge project. He was looking for an angle. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you've had the money to cover our mortgage and tuition all this time, and you just sat there in my house, eating my food, pretending to be broke?" He took a step forward, and I saw his hands go into his jacket pockets, not casually but deliberately, the way a man does when he's trying to keep them still. "That's not charity, Arthur. That's deception." I stood up. I'm not a large man, but I've spent 35 years standing in front of planning boards and union negotiators, and I know how to hold ground without raising my voice. "Randall," I said, "you've never asked me a single question about my finances. Not one. You assumed I had nothing because I drove an old sedan and wore sweaters with holes in the elbows. You looked at me and saw a liability. That assumption was yours. The deception, if there was one, was in your own mind." He didn't like that. His jaw tightened, and I saw him glance at Lydia for support. But she was staring at the ground, her hands limp in her lap. That's when I decided to give him the rest. The part I hadn't told Lydia yet, because I was saving it for a moment when I needed to be absolutely clear about who held which cards. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, the one I'd carried for years. Inside was a folded document, and I unfolded it with the same deliberate care I had used on the first. "I want you both to understand something," I said. "The Margaret Hawthorne Family Foundation isn't just a charitable fund that sends checks when you run short. It's a legal trust instrument, set up with specific provisions and triggers. One of those triggers, Section 7, Paragraph 3, states that if any beneficiary attempts to remove the primary benefactor from a residence he occupies by right, without that benefactor's free and informed consent, the board is required to initiate a clawback review of all distributions made to that beneficiary over the previous 10 years. A clawback review. That means the foundation can demand repayment of every dollar it has ever disbursed to you. The mortgage assistance, the tuition, the dorm fees, all of it, with statutory interest. And because the foundation is structured as a charitable remainder trust, those repayments would not be dischargeable in bankruptcy." The silence that followed that statement was so complete I could hear the water circulating in the fountain 30 yards away. Randall's face had gone from righteous anger to something very different. It wasn't fear yet, but it was the anteroom of fear. The moment when a man realizes the floor he's standing on is not as solid as he believed. "You can't do that," he said, but his voice had lost its volume. "That's not legal." "It is," I said, "because I wrote the charter. I sat with the estate attorney for 6 months in 2009 designing every clause. I didn't expect to ever use this one. I created it as a safeguard, a way to ensure that if I ever became incapacitated, no one could move me out of my own home and drain the foundation's resources for their own ends." I paused. "You tried to do exactly that, Randall. For that, the clause doesn't require malicious intent. It only requires the attempt." And the attempt happened. Lydia finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse. "Dad, I was the one who made that call." Randall didn't know I was looking at facilities. I had kept it from him. That was the first time that day I felt something like genuine hope. She was trying to protect him. That was the daughter I remembered. But Randall's reaction killed it. He turned to her, and I saw something ugly pass over his face, something that told me he had known exactly what she was planning and had perhaps even encouraged it. "You told them?" he said to her, voice sharp. "You told your mother about Clarksville?" "I thought we agreed to wait." Lydia blinked. "Wait for what?" "To get all the paperwork in order," he said, and then immediately shut his mouth as if he'd said too much. The words hung there. All the paperwork. I saw it then, the shape of the whole plan. Randall had been the one driving this. He had seen the money bleeding, had run the numbers on my room and board, and had decided the solution was to remove the old man. Not out of desperation, but out of cold calculation. And Lydia, overwhelmed and fearful, had gone along. I felt a deep, quiet anger, the kind that doesn't shout because it's too busy filing evidence. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at Randall and said, "You were going to have me declared incompetent." That's what the paperwork was. A petition for guardianship. Then you could move me wherever you wanted and take control of my assets. But you didn't know I had any assets, so you thought you were just offloading a burden. He didn't deny it. He just stood there, the weight of it settling. The worst part was that he had underestimated me so completely that he hadn't even bothered to check. He had seen an old man in a cardigan and never looked deeper. And now the foundation, the very money he had unknowingly relied on for a decade, was poised to become a weapon that could unmake his family's financial future. I put the notebook back in my pocket. "But I'm not going to initiate the clawback," I said. "Not yet. Not automatically. I want something first." Randall looked at me with suspicion, but Lydia raised her head. "What?" she asked. "I want you to sit down with me tomorrow morning in the conference room at Willowbrook. Both of you. And the girls. My granddaughters. They deserve to know the truth about what their parents nearly did, and about who has been paying for their education. They are adults. If we are going to rebuild this family, it has to be on a foundation of honest memory, not comfortable silence." Lydia nodded. Randall started to protest, but she put a hand on his arm, and for once, he stopped. "There's one more thing," I said. "The house you live in, the house I bought in 1983, the house where your mother's coffee cup still sits on the shelf. It's not yours. It was transferred into the Foundation's trust 12 years ago, with a life estate clause that guarantees me the right to occupy it until my death. I moved out voluntarily. But legally, I still hold the life estate. If I wanted to, I could move back in tomorrow, and there is nothing you could do to stop me. The house you were so worried about losing, you never actually owned. You were tenants, and I was the landlord who never charged rent." The color drained from Randall's face. I turned and began walking back toward the main building. Gerald was waiting on the veranda, and he had a chess set out. Over my shoulder, I said, "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Bring the girls. We'll have coffee, and we'll talk about what happens next." Then I sat down across from Gerald, moved my king's pawn forward 2 squares, and let the afternoon settle around us. The real conversation was still ahead, and it was going to determine everything that remained of my family. The next morning, I woke at 6, which is my habit. I showered, dressed in a clean button-down and the same worn cardigan I'd worn the day before, and walked down to the conference room. Harriet had arranged a long table with a white cloth, a coffee service, and 5 chairs. I sat at the head and waited. At exactly 9 o'clock, Lydia walked in, followed by Randall, and behind them came my granddaughters, Emma and Claire. Emma was 21, Claire 19. They had their mother's hair and their grandmother's eyes, and when they looked at me, I saw confusion and alarm in equal measure. Lydia had clearly not told them everything. I asked them to sit. Harriet poured coffee and then retreated, closing the doors behind her. For a moment, nobody spoke. Emma looked around the room, at the tall windows, the polished table, the view of the courtyard, and said, "Grandpa, this place is incredible. How are you paying for it?" It was the same question her mother had asked, but from her it sounded like genuine curiosity, not accusation. That gave me an opening. I placed the Foundation's charter document, the distribution summary, and the clawback provision on the table. I walked them through what I had told Lydia the day before. The trust, the anonymous support, the 10 years of mortgage and tuition payments. Claire's eyes went wide. "You paid for my entire freshman year?" she said. I nodded. "And your sister's tuition, and the roof repair the summer before that." Their father sat rigid, looking at the documents as if they might bite him. When I finished, Emma was crying, quietly, tears rolling down her cheeks onto her lap. Claire stared at her parents with something I had not seen in a young person's face in a long time. "Betrayal? You two knew," Claire said, looking at Randall and Lydia. "You knew about the money." "No," Lydia said quickly. "We didn't know it was him. We thought it was some anonymous grant." "But that's not what bothers me," Claire said, and her voice was beginning to tremble with anger. "What bothers me is that you were going to put Grandpa in a home. A cheap home. After all that anonymous help, whether you knew it was him or not, you were going to discard him the moment he became inconvenient." Randall started to protest. He said something about financial pressure, about making hard choices, but Claire cut him off. She stood up, walked around the table, and put her arms around my shoulders. I felt the weight of her embrace, and it unlocked something in my chest I had not known was locked. Emma joined her. I let them hold me for a while. Then I gently patted their hands and asked them to sit back down. "There is one piece left," I said, "and it's the piece that changes what happens next." I drew a folded sheet from my pocket, the last document I had prepared. It was a letter, handwritten, dated the day I moved out of the house. I read it aloud. "To Lydia, Randall, Emma, and Claire. If you are reading this, it means you have come to find me. I forgive you. Not because what you planned was right, but because I refuse to let my last years be defined by a grudge. The Foundation's clawback provision exists, but I am the sole person authorized to initiate it. I am not going to, nor am I moving back into the house. The life estate is terminated as of this morning. The deed will be transferred into Lydia's name, free and clear, within the week. The house was always meant to be hers, and your mother's yellow kitchen should stay in the family." I paused. "But there is a condition." Randall finally met my eyes. His face was pale, stripped of the usual bluster. I said, "The condition is that we never again pretend. No more secrets about money. No more assumptions about who can contribute and who is a burden. I want a monthly family dinner here at Willowbrook, where we talk openly about what we need and what we can offer each other. I want Emma and Claire to know the full story, and I want them to understand that their grandfather did not build this foundation out of guilt or control, but out of love for their grandmother and for them." Lydia was crying now, silent and undone, the way she had not allowed herself to cry the day before. She stood up from her chair, walked over to me, and knelt by my side. She took my hand, the one with the age spots and the knuckles that stiffen in cold weather, and she said, "Daddy, I am so sorry." I said, "I know, sweetheart, and I mean it." She asked if I would ever come home. I told her I was home. Willowbrook suited me. The library had a first edition of Churchill I was working through. Gerald and I had a chess rivalry that was growing serious, and I liked the garden. But I promised to visit. I promised to be present. I told her that I would never disappear from her life, not out of anger or pride. Randall remained seated. After a long silence, he cleared his throat. He said, "Arthur, I don't know how to fix this." I looked at him and said, "You start by being better to my daughter. That's all I've ever wanted. Not subservience. Not repayment. Better." He nodded. And for the first time in 6 years, I believed he was listening. The final surprise came when Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a letter of her own. She said she had written it the night before, after her mother had called and told her a partial version of events. She read it to us. In it, she wrote about how she had always admired my quiet strength, how she had noticed the way I listened more than I spoke, and how she had decided, just 2 days earlier, to change her major to social work so she could help older adults in situations exactly like mine. She said she didn't know why, but something had pulled her in that direction. I looked at her, and I understood. Generations repeat themselves in ways we don't anticipate. The bridge I built with my own hands decades ago was now being walked across by the granddaughter I never expected to follow my path of service. Claire, the younger one, spoke last. She said, "Grandpa, I want to know everything. About the foundation. About how you saved that money. About Grandma. Will you tell me?" I said, "I will tell you everything, but you have to promise to beat me at Scrabble first." She laughed. The first genuine, unforced laugh I had heard from anyone in my family in months. We stayed in that conference room until noon. We ordered sandwiches. Randall relaxed. Fractionally, Lydia held my hand for most of it. When they finally left, I walked them to the parking lot. Randall shook my hand and held it a beat longer than necessary. Lydia hugged me as if she were 10 again, and I was tucking her in. As their car pulled away, I stood at the entrance and watched until it turned the corner. I thought about the yellow kitchen. I thought about Ellen, and how she would have handled all of this with more grace and fewer documents, but probably the same outcome. I thought about the long arc of a life and how the work of a father is never really finished. It just changes shape. That evening, Gerald challenged me to a rematch. I beat him in 14 moves, which he insisted was a fluke. But as I put away the pieces, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Ellen died. Peace. Not the peace of having won, but the peace of having completed something that mattered. And that, I realized, was always the point. I spent 35 years building bridges, not the ones that make headlines, but the ones that carry people across rivers they cross every day without a second thought. The bridges you never notice because they never fail. That's the kind of father I tried to be. Quiet, dependable, strong enough to hold weight without complaint. And when I discovered my own daughter had decided I was no longer worth the upkeep, I didn't collapse. I reinforced the foundation under her feet without her even knowing it. That's what parents do, if they can. We build the things that hold up our children even when our children forget who laid the beams. The question I'm left with, the one I think about in the garden at Willowbrook, is what happens in families where there is no secret foundation. Where the old man in the cardigan is exactly as broke as he appears. How many parents are being quietly shuffled toward the cheapest available room because they stopped earning and started costing? How many daughters are making phone calls like the one Lydia made, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion, and then having to live with the consequences? I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does. But I have a hunch that the remedy starts with the thing we all ran out of somewhere along the way: honest conversation. Not about bank balances, but about worth. The worth of a human being in a world that wants to measure everything by utility. Lydia and I talk now. Really talk. She comes to the garden on Tuesdays. Randall is learning, slowly, that silence is not the same as weakness. The girls call me every weekend. The yellow kitchen is still yellow, and the house is hers. I gave it to her, not because she earned it back, but because holding on to resentment would have been the one thing I couldn't afford. And I've always been careful with my resources. If this story has stayed with you, maybe you recognize someone in it. A parent, a child, a version of yourself that made a hard choice and didn't realize the weight of it until later. Let it sit with you. And if you think someone needs to hear what quiet dignity looks like, share it. These stories aren't about revenge. They're about remembering that the person across the dinner table, no matter how old or inconvenient, has a history you might not know and a future you can still shape. If you've made it this far, do us one small favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it tells us that these stories matter to you. Thank you, genuinely, for that. I am going to finish my coffee now. Gerald owes me a rematch, and I fully intend to beat him again. But before I go, I'll leave you with this. The greatest power a parent has is not control. It's the ability to keep loving when love is the only leverage you have left. I used that leverage, and I am still standing in my garden, watering my tomatoes exactly where I belong.